from anywhere. More at ooma.com.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices. It's 12:06. Time for KUOW's Week in Review.
Hi, it's Ross Reynolds. I'm in for Bill Radke again this week. And on Week in Review, we've got a lot to look back on. The police chief resigning, the massive budget deficits that are coming into place locally and also at the state capitol, and Kamala Harris as Joe Biden's vice president pick, plus those tiny moments of joy. Yes, there are a few of them, and we're going to review them in this program. We'll be talking about those stories with our panel, Tony Black, reporter for King 5, DJ Wilson, publisher of the Washington State Wire, and Brandi Kruse, correspondent at Q13 TV. Welcome, and thanks to all of you for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Ross.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start at the top. Seattle Police Chief Carmen Best announced she's stepping down after a series of clashes with the Seattle City Council over police tactics and the budget.
This is not about the money, and it certainly isn't about, the demonstrators. I mean, be real, I have a lot thicker skin than that.
And the chief criticized the Seattle City Council's budget moves.
The council gave us $1.6 million to make sure that we hired the best and the brightest and the most diverse and brought them on. And less than a year later, we're going to just turn them all away. It feels very duplicitous. And honestly, I have my convictions. I cannot do that.
And as you heard in our newscast just a moment ago, Seattle City Council member Teresa Mosqueda says the actions by the council were not intended to drive the chief from her job, but apparently they did that. That quite obviously happened. Brandi, let's start with you. We've got both sides kind of blaming one another. We've got the mayor and the police chief saying it was micromeddling from the council saying that the chief was not following what they wanted to do when it came to fighting large-scale unrest in the streets. What do you make of this?
Yeah, and I think the phrase the mayor used was they wanted to be mini police chiefs. The mayor and the chief really speaking bluntly at this press conference, announcing the chief's resignation, which formally is a retirement. Look, working together on this is what made sense to do, and it didn't happen. The reality is that while the council can go through, and it did go through and say, cut here, cut there, SWAT team, harbor patrol, in reality, ultimately, the decisions were going to be up to the chief anyway, where those cuts came from. So by not working with her on it on the front end, they were setting themselves up for the possibility that the department and the chief wouldn't even make the cuts they wanted anyway. So in that sense, they were more sort of symbolic cuts that the council made. And so it made no sense. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of energy to go through and do it without consulting the chief. And now on the back end, you have council members putting out statements saying we need to work forward collaboratively, moving ahead, but it was working together collaboratively that the chief of police wanted to do to begin with. They didn't do it, and now she's gone.
Is this city council mayor rift just politics as usual? Does the effort to recall Mayor Durkin, supported by some council members, turn this conflict into something more than politics as usual? Tony Black, what do you think?
I think the council, they seem to be a lot more active in drama there than I would see with other councils, even around the country. It seems like they're really trying hard to build a brand almost for themselves and, show that they're going to be this big, council that makes all this change. And that doesn't mean that that is a bad thing, but how they're necessarily going about it has proven to be pretty problematic. I mean, it seems like they're talking out of both sides almost. On one side where, they're coming after the mayor or they're coming after the chief. And then they're saying on statements like Brandi just mentioned that, hey, we want to work together and this wasn't personal, when Chief Best made it very clear that, the animosity that she felt did feel personal. So.
DJ Wilson, personalities, of course, are always part of politics and any kind of negotiation. The mayor told me yesterday she's on the phone with individual council members. Do you have any sense of how this might get resolved, these kind of continuing battles between the Seattle City Council and Mayor Durkin?
I think resolution is probably a long ways off. I think one of the things that we sort of take for granted in the tick-tock of daily politics, whether it's federal or city, is there is natural and structural tension between the mayor and the city council. They are meant to be in some tension. And it's actually at every level, any kind of city, and this is the case at the state level with the governor and the legislature and Congress and the president, it is almost always very good politics for the executive to paint the legislative body as sort of mindless and incoherent and reactionary. We see it at every level. So in part, I think what this is a function, or rather a result of, is really very overly tense and really poor relations between the mayor and the council for some time. It's not unique to this mayor, but it is particularly active with this administration and this council. And so this didn't come out of nowhere. This is not a data point that just arose here in August. I think this is best understood within the context of a long-standing rift between the Durkin administration and the city council.
When it comes to that rift, do you see, the mayor, of course, was talking about conciliation on both sides. I'm just kind of wondering where that comes from. What part of the fallout also from the chief leaving is that the mayor says she doesn't even want to begin a search for a new police chief with the budget in disarray. And she also has been pretty frank about some of the council's actions on what she calls micromanaging the police, discourage her from looking for a new police chief. She told me that Seattle's reputation to attract good police chiefs might suffer because of the resignation of Carmen Best, who was respected widely. What are your thoughts on the delay of hiring a new police chief? Brandi, what do you think?
Yeah, and first, I just want to comment on something DJ said about this natural sort of rift between the 7th floor of City Hall and the 2nd floor of City Hall. Some of that is healthy, but at the same time, and where I think, and it speaks to a point that Tony made, where I think that this council is in the wrong. It is not, can I say sexy on KUOW? It is not the sexiest thing to go behind closed doors, do the work, put the work in, work together, hash things out. What this council really likes is the public statements and the public declarations and being the ones to get the credit and all this stuff. When in reality, you can look at a 3-hour council meeting, and when you actually take into consideration all the stuff they said of substance, it probably boils down to about 15 minutes. And so they could really use a little bit more of doing the work, even though it doesn't get them the attention, and a little bit less of going after the mayor and all of these things. But on the halt for a new police chief search, it sounds an awful lot like Adrian Diaz, the current deputy chief, incoming interim police chief, is likely going to be the person who ends up leading the agency, because you'd really be living in la land if you thought somebody wanted to come from the outside and be the Seattle police chief right now. And the mayor made a great point about that. You don't even know the job they're applying for. And you got done with a scenario where the council came this close, within inches of cutting the chief's salary to $170,000 a year, which is not comparable to what other chiefs in major cities get. So I know people say
they later backed off.
Yeah, that's why I said they came this close and they didn't. But at the same time, when things are so imbalanced and teetering on the edge, as a chief, and I know chiefs will say, well, I'm not in it for the money, but that is a big factor in moving to a city like Seattle where things are expensive. And so I think until things calm down, somebody would be out their mind to come to Seattle and apply for that job.
Hey, I want to get Tony and DJ to weigh in here. You just heard Brandi say the city council is wrong. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would say.
I mentioned earlier, as I was saying earlier, they their ideas, like there's a lot of statements, like after Chief Best announced her retirement, each individual council member dropped some type of statement, as opposed to maybe just dropping a united statement saying that we as a council did not intend to do this. And, when you intend to not hurt someone's feelings, it doesn't mean that you didn't hurt their feelings. So it's, intent can be, discussed in its own way there. But this council went, like I said, it doesn't seem like what they're trying to do is necessarily wrong. It's just how they're going about it has proven to be very, very troublesome and problematic. And they're like burning bridges on both ends there. And so that's where I feel the issue is. And as far as having a police chief from the outside, like Brandi said, he'd be living in la land, because there's no way that a police chief would want to come into this scenario knowing that they don't have the support of a city council that has made it pretty clear that they're kind of doing, I guess, their own thing, so to speak.
DJ, what do you think about the statement that the council is wrong?
Yeah, I think it's reflective, both what Brandi and Tony are saying, of what I think is probably mainstream opinion on this outside of City Hall. But I think that, I liken it to the old adage politicians use about sausage, which is to say, I like breakfast, I like bacon, I like sausage. The best way for me to become a vegetarian is to go see how sausage is made. And if you like politics, you have to accept it's a dirty game. It's nonlinear. It goes all over the place, and governance is just sometimes ugly. So, frankly, it's indefensible how we make sausage, I think, and it's indefensible how policy is made at a city council meeting. 3 hours to say 15 minutes is exactly right. That is how it works, and it's ugly and terrible and mindless. But it doesn't happen within a vacuum. And the key piece of grandstanding is true for the council, and it's true for this mayor, and it's true for any elected official. And so while today we are, in mainstream opinion, may be against the council, 2 months ago, people were saying that the mayor couldn't control her own police department. 4 months ago, we were saying the mayor is doing a fabulous job managing COVID response. And so we don't want to get too caught up into the sort of passion of the moment. The reality is this administration and this council are, they have as bad of relations with responsibility on both of their parts. Since Mayor Nichols told the council no city administrative department heads could speak with any council members back in like 2004, 2005. So it's worse now than it's ever been. And you just don't have a situation like this unless both dance partners are responsible.
And Ross, if I can clarify what I mean by the council is wrong. And this might be a controversial statement, but defunding the police, when you actually look at it, should be a non-controversial idea. It is not controversial to want to get to a place where we have heavier investments in community programs and fewer investments in policing. That's a world we should all want to live in. But if the council wants to get there in the most productive, direct, and successful way, they need to do it in a way where they're working with all the parties involved. And that includes the chief of police. And the chief of police was not anti-reform. And I think she understood the value in eventually over time creating a society that relied less heavily on police officers. So to shut her out was counter to the claim that they made that this is something they're very committed to doing. And also they said they wanted to do it with the input of Black community leaders. Chief Carmen Best was a Black community leader.
But some folks in the Black Lives Matter movement said that not much changed at the Seattle Police Department over the time that she was there, and also saying it was too much for one person to do. The chief alone can't kind of steer the ship. If you're just tuned in, we're talking today about the Week in Review. My guests are Brandi Kruse, correspondent for Q13 TV, DJ Wilson, publisher of the Washington State Wire, and also Tony Black, who's a reporter for King 5. Danny Westmead wrote an interesting column this week about a warning for the fall election. He said the COVID-19 denial crowd did terrific in last week's voting. Republican House Leader J.T. Cox had COVID and has come out the other side. But I'm kind of wondering what governance looks like if our leaders start to get sick. Any thoughts on what's going to happen if more of these politicians fall ill and hopefully pull through, of course? What do you say, DJ?
Yeah, I think there's a real open question that we have not grappled with there as a community, which is to say, arguably right now or by now, we should have had a special session in the state legislature to address a budget deficit. There's state law that says whenever the general fund, the state dollars, the state portion of the general fund goes into deficit, that the governor is required to make across the board cuts, and that the legislature typically would come into session to then prioritize those cuts and make adjustments as necessary. That's what we saw in the last recession under Governor Gregoire. We have not yet seen that in this administration. And I think there's a lot of politics there, and there's reasonable minds can differ on that. But one of the things I think that underlies that is that we don't really yet know how. We have not yet set rules for how we will go back into a legislative session where you'll have 147 members patting backs metaphorically and shaking hands on the floor metaphorically with 1,000 lobbyists, third house members participating in the advocacy and the conversation. And what we, I think, believe, if I might speak on behalf of, I think, sober minds, is it's not a great way to come back to fight off COVID by getting everybody back into a closed room real quickly and doing everything the way we did it a year ago. So there's politics limiting our states addressing the financial situation, certainly, but we don't yet know how to govern in this time of COVID. Other states like Utah set this out really early and created a telehealth model. They're going to have a third special session next week, which is pretty interesting and innovative. But in our case, for different reasons, some arguably constitutional and others, I think, related to just the timing of the 2020 elections and where we find ourselves, coming back into session isn't something that's yet on anyone's radar screen.
Well, while we're talking about coronavirus, just last summer, it would have been pretty normal to hear a concert like this in Cal Anderson Park. But not so normal these days with social distancing. Brandi, you were following the story. What was happening in Cal Anderson Park last weekend?
Are you referring to the religious concert? Is that what that was?
Yes, that's what that was.
This was some sort of gathering, religious gathering, no masks, with a lot of singing and dancing. And I mean, that's basically what it was, is a maskless group of people. I know there was some criticism of it, but.
You've got this real split in opinion. Public gatherings, religious and political, can be a health problem, of course, because of COVID. But banning public gatherings, and there's the accusation that you're kind of limiting speech. I'm kind of wondering how this problem gets worked out when it comes to our society right now. What do you think about that, Tony?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Tony.
Go ahead.
Well, so I guess in regards to that religious event that happened on Sunday, I think I read an article somewhere that discussed how both the governor's office had one idea of what Seattle police should have done with that, and Seattle police had another idea as far as like enforcing that regulation that shouldn't have happened. Cal Anderson Park was also closed, so there's no reason that they should have been there anyways. But there does seem to be, at least as regards to religious gatherings, at least from some of the stories that I've covered, usually it involves a situation where they are gathering and they are not wearing masks, and they're kind of, I don't want to speak for them by any means, but like the idea is that they don't necessarily need to be wearing the mask or following these social distancing for their reasons of going to these gatherings. And so it's almost a defiant kind of way, and it's a weird look. It's kind of a weird topic to even really touch on. But most of the time, from story tips that I get, at least from ones that I've been covering, it's about, well, hey, these people were gathering at this religious event. They went on a retreat. They came back. Someone got coronavirus, and now they're trying to keep it under wraps. They haven't really faced as much scrutiny as far as the regulations in comparison to even like gyms and fitness centers have. And that's something that, in stories I've covered with them, they brought that up as well too, is how they seem to be far more restricted in their things, where they're trying to do something healthy. We're wearing masks and doing the proper social distancing. And then there's events like at Cal Anderson where there's hundreds of people screaming and singing at the top of their lungs. The stories with droplets going further when you sing. So it's kind of a weird paradox there, for at least for me.
The government needs to be, I think the governor has missed out on the opportunity to, and opportunity is not the word I wanted, but on the decision about whether to crack down on these things. Going back to the very beginning, where you had people who were against his mandate show up at the state capitol. I remember asking him at the time, what are you going to do if these people came? And that was at the very beginning, when the ban on large gatherings has just gone into effect, that we did not know how the governor's office or the state patrol would respond, and they didn't do anything. And the reality is, once you make that decision that you're going to allow them their First Amendment rights, which, this is like the constitutional versus the safety situation. And also, the governor and the mayor, they haven't said a whole lot about protesters being out and about. And I know that they wear masks. So we had a march with 80,000 people. And for some reason, there is a hesitancy to speak about the possible dangers there. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic and you have 80,000 people marching shoulder to shoulder in the streets. And so if you're not going to talk about that in a serious way, about the impact that could have on the pandemic, and then you want to crack down on a few hundred people being in a park sitting, there's a little bit of hypocrisy there. And I know the mask wearage is different, but masks aren't 100% effective. And so I just think that, there's hypocrisy going around about what large gatherings we're going to look the other way on because of the message, the underlying fight for justice and equality in this country, versus, the religious gathering in a park.
Sure. What's your point when you mention masks are not 100% effective?
Well, I'm just saying that if you're, and I'm not saying masks aren't effective. I have one right here. I wear it everywhere I go. All I'm saying is that if you are a group of 60,000 to 80,000 people and you're shoulder to shoulder, no medical professional is going to tell me that the chance of people in that crowd getting coronavirus is 0%. And so you have to acknowledge the risk of being out in any large group protesting during a pandemic. And you can't just look the other way because you agree with the underlying message. That's the only point I'm making.
Yep. It's Week in Review. I'm Ross Reynolds in for Bill Radke with Brandi Kruse, correspondent for Q13 TV, DJ Wilson, publisher of the Washington State Wire, and Tony Black, a reporter for King 5. We'll be back in just a moment.
KUOW 94.9, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices.
The coronavirus pandemic has sent the markets crashing and soaring, and it's created new opportunities for illegal insider trading. But NPR has found the Trump administration brought the fewest charges for insider trading in decades.
That means they are not trying.
An NPR investigation this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
I'm Paige Browning. Also today on All Things Considered, I'll have the latest stories from the Puget Sound region starting this afternoon at 3 on KUOW 94.9 and KUOW.
It is 73 degrees in Seattle. We're expecting a sunny afternoon with a high of 77. It's 12:28, and we return to KUOW's Week in Review.
I'm Ross Reynolds in for Bill Radke. My guests this week, Tony Black, reporter for King 5, DJ Wilson, publisher of the Washington State Wire, and Brandi Kruse, correspondent for Q13 TV. Danny Westneat's column this week, warning for fall election. The COVID-19 denial crowd did terrific in last week's voting. Westneat singled out Republican Robert Sutherland in Snohomish County, who's calling for a rebellion against pandemic restrictions. Let's talk a little bit more about the results that came out of the primary election, and particularly how the GOP came up out of that. DJ, how'd you see this?
I think the top line issue here is that the general mainstream assumption in the central Puget Sound region, at least, that 2020 will be a really banner year for Democrats. That's a narrative that didn't hold in the results from this primary. That may still well be the case. I expect it will still be the case. But in this primary, that's not what happened. And usually people argue, again, it's sort of mainstream thinking that the higher the turnout, the more likely Democrats are to benefit from that. We had record turnout at 55% of the state electorate here this year and for the primary. And again, it wasn't a strong result for Democrats. I do think, though, that you can't make general assumptions fit specific instances. In the legislature, there are 3 districts that are considered swing districts. Well, 3 districts that have 1 House member that's a Democrat and 1 House member that's a Republican. They're split districts. That's the 10th in Island County, the 28th in Lakewood and University Place, and the 16th down in Southwest Washington near Grays Harbor County. And in each of those cases with a split district, the Republicans are very strong and leading. It looks like potentially the Democrats would lose a seat in the House, or maybe 2, and the Democrats would lose a seat in the Senate there. So that doesn't fit the narrative. And moreover, it's interesting, I think, in the 8th congressional district, where Kim Schreier has been an effective freshman Democratic member, working her district hard, fundraising, slave to the grind of congressional work. She underperformed, in the net Democratic performance underperformed her performance 2 years ago. Statewide, the partisan races, or where there's a partisan label like Democratic and Republican, generally went strongly Democratic because of the toxicity of the Republican brand here in Washington State.
I want to get to Brandi, because she has also flagged this going on when it comes to the 8th district and Dr. Kim Schreier. Brandi, do you think she's vulnerable?
Well, I do, and I will admit I was a little surprised by it. She is far out fundraising her Republican opponents, but when you look at the top 3 Republican vote getters in the 8th, the 2 top, Jesse Jensen and Keith Swank. Keith Swank, by the way, who's a Seattle PD captain who believes that, and I don't think he's used the word hoax, but is basically a COVID-19 denier. When you add up the Republican votes, they outpace Kim Schreier. And I mean, you have to consider that Kim Schreier is the first Democrat to ever hold the 8th congressional district
Right.
seat. So it's not as if it's a solidly blue seat or anything. But she got like 43% of the vote in the primary with 55% turnout. And I don't see her flipping any voter who voted for a Republican in the primary because they are so antithetical to her. They're not similar candidates at all. And so she is going to have a fight ahead because those Republican voters, primary voters, are not giving their votes to Kim Schreier.
DJ, there's quite a race for a lieutenant governor. I've noticed. I didn't really, is it just me, or is this a much more high profile race for some reason this year? Denny Heck, the former congressman, is running for that post. He's one of the top 2 vote getters. What's going on with that anyway?
I think it's a really high profile race in 3 people's minds: Marco Leus, Denny Heck, and mine, and maybe nobody else. So I think you're in good company, Ross. So we had 2 Democrats make it through to the general election, as you mentioned, member of Congress and a sitting state senator. And that creates a lot of sort of interesting dynamics. One is now you've got a moderate Democrat with in the form of Denny Heck running against a more progressive member in the former Marco Leus. And what does that mean for how big money might play in the state? Normally, lieutenant governor is not a race that big money plays in, but because of the lack of any race for the governor's seat, that creates some question. And secondly, if Jay Inslee ends up in a Biden administration, assuming Joe Biden wins the election, that's going to create an opening that the lieutenant governor would accede to. And that would mean that Marco Leus or Denny Heck would be the next governor. Now, just to comment on math, with 2 Democrats on the ballot, if a Republican were to run a write-in campaign and the Republican only got the very mediocre base of about 40% of the turnout, 40% of the vote, that would mean that Marco Leus and Denny Heck would have to split 60%. And if one of them gets 35%, one of them gets 25%, then that means you'll have a Republican as lieutenant governor and then a Republican as governor in a strongly Democratic state if Jay Inslee vacates and goes to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, Jay Inslee would never leave, though, if that were going to happen.
I want to turn to national politics. Kamala Harris is Joe Biden's choice for vice president. The senator comes from a justice background as a former attorney general in California. She's the first Black woman, first Asian American, first daughter of 2 immigrants to join a major party presidential ticket. By some accounts, I've seen that this has really been considered a real safe bet for Joe Biden to make when it comes to his vice presidential candidate. Tony Black, do you agree?
I do think it was the safe bet. It was the strong choice and, quite honestly, the obvious choice for Joe Biden to make in that regard. After saying that he was going to pick a woman, and then given everything that's been happening as regards to social justice, it was almost like if he didn't, it would cause more issues than not. But I believe that Harris is a great, strong candidate for the vice presidential pick. She understands the context of the history that she could be making in her position. She's going to be strong in the debates, and I believe it's a good pairing for the 2 there. I know that there's been a lot of talk back and forth about not wanting or wanting cop social justice reform and then picking a former cop or picking a cop or anything like that. There's plenty of memes and everything out there that you can find on the internet about her pick there. But I think that there's also some memes out there saying that, well, if you don't like her necessarily, but you need to vote for her, then vote for her, get her in, and then hold them accountable in office. And that might be a kind of a perspective that some people maybe want to try to look into more.
Bottom line, Brandi Kruse, do you think this really helps the Democratic ticket to have Kamala Harris on the?
Well, look, I think some people will say that this is Biden trying to check boxes, but I don't think being a person of color is a box, and I don't think being a woman is a box. I think that she brings legitimate lived experiences to the ticket that Joe Biden does not possess, that Mike Pence does not possess, and that Donald Trump does not possess. And so I think in the ability to appeal to the experience of women in this country and of people of color in this country, even though some might tag her for that background in criminal justice, I think that it does help Biden's ticket in that way. And one point I want to make on this is, America has come a long way since 2008 when Sarah Palin was a vice presidential candidate. The press was incredibly sexist towards Sarah Palin. from whether she could be a mom on the campaign trail to the way she dressed and the way she spoke. We've gone through the Me Too movement, and I think the press has learned a lesson from covering that campaign. My fear is, and what I don't want the media to do, is go far in the other direction to make up for it. Kamala Harris does not need any member of the media to take it easy on her. She didn't get where she is by people taking it easy on her. And she might be the president of the United States one day. So I hope the press does what it's supposed to do and treats her like a politician, doesn't interfere with kid gloves or bubble wrap, because she does not need it.
Well, Hillary Clinton weighed in on this. She said she hopes Harris faces a less sexist media coverage.
I still hope, especially with Kamala on the ticket, that the coverage of women running for president or vice president will be less sexist, less sensationalist, less trivializing. I told them that they would just have to, be ready for that and be able to ride through it.
Brandi Kruse, have you seen any sexist coverage of Kamala Harris coming out as the vice presidential candidate?
Not from the press, but the president called her nasty, which I think, he tends to call strong, smart women nasty. And I think that it's sexist. And so, there are so many things to criticize or to hold Kamala Harris accountable for, or to question her political record, her background, all of these things. And to me, this is, what I don't understand is there's this debate over, was that sexist, was that not? To me, sexism is so clear. It's either sexist or it's not. Would you be asking this of a male candidate, or wouldn't you be? And so I haven't seen necessarily any sexist media coverage. There was a Politico article that talked about, before she was chosen, that she might not be because she didn't show enough remorse for the infamous busing incident, where she called out Joe Biden's record on busing on the debate stage. It was a very poor moment for Joe Biden. But, Kamala Harris had nothing to be remorseful for. She was trying to be president at the time. And it was a powerful moment for her. So to suggest that she needed to be remorseful to get back into Joe Biden's good graces, I don't know if that was sexist or just a really bad news article.
Here's what Donald Trump had to say about Kamala Harris.
I heard it today that she doesn't meet the requirements. And by the way, the lawyer that wrote that piece is a very highly qualified, very talented lawyer. I have no idea if that's right. I would have assumed the Democrats would have checked that out before she gets chosen to run for vice president.
So already the president raising birther questions about Kamala Harris. I love his phrasing in the middle of that. I have no idea if that's right. You can say just about anything and then say, I have no idea if that's right or not. Is she going to really help the Biden ticket, particularly because people are going to be scrutinizing her, not merely as the vice president, but also, given Biden's age, very possibly the next president, if Biden is unable to serve out a term, assuming he's elected. She would certainly be in the front of the row if it comes to another election with her. DJ Wilson, what do you think?
I think she does add a unique characteristic and will help the ticket. I mean, most of the decisions made about the presidential candidate and nominee, there's no question about that. But this is, as Joe Biden put it, one of the first really important decisions that a presidential candidate is going to make. And so it's a signal to the populace about intent and values. And for a Democrat to win, you've got to bring home the vote in places like Michigan and Wisconsin. And to do that as a Democrat, you got to mobilize African-American voters in Milwaukee and Detroit. And so if you can't do that, and there was sort of an open conversation about how well Biden really understood the African-American vote and how well he was communicating with it. They had a couple of gaffes. Many people call them gaffes, maybe he wouldn't, but with African-American journalists. And it just, I think that it was a sensitivity, but I think there's this great story and coverage today in the New York Times on how the Harris choice was made and what it signals about Biden. And what I think it signals, according to that reporting, is something that we know about him, is that loyalty is important. Relationships are important. So folks that he has in his universe often come from his experience in the Senate, like Chris Dodd in that story that Brandi mentioned. And so it's no surprise he picks a senator. It's also interesting to think about his 28-year relationship with our senior senator, Patty Murray. Just this week, I'm starting to hear rumors that she's being elevated to the top of the list in maybe a HHS cabinet position. So it may not be Governor Inslee that goes to DC, maybe Patty Murray, but I think it tells us about Biden's thinking.
That's Health and Human Services, so some thought of her perhaps going there. We're talking about the week in review. We're taking a look at some of the big news that took place over the past few weeks and getting your thoughts on it. Tony Black, when you think about Kamala Harris, she's a first in many ways, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the first Black woman, first Asian American woman, first daughter of 2 immigrants to join the ticket. That'll certainly help her in some quarters and hurt her in other quarters, I think. How do you think this is going to balance out for the Democrats?
I think it's going to be an important 3 months coming up for the Democratic ticket, and having Harris on that ticket with Biden is going to be important to a lot of things that DJ was talking about. That Biden did have some pretty significant slip ups, I guess, with the Black community, and some of the comments that he made are kind of just generalizing. I think it was his comment about, if you didn't vote for me, you ain't Black, or something like that. And it's like, you hear that and you're like, whoa, like, what are you talking about? So this is certainly his way of, he does have a lot of loyalty to Harris. She's going to be one of the most important pieces as far as going forward for the Democrats, as far as trying to get into the White House, because she is going to be that deciding factor. She's going to be able to help get those votes from the African-American community, from the Asian American community, or, because there are some Black people who are just like, I want nothing to do with Biden because of some of the comments that he's made, but they can understand and respect with what Harris brings to the table. As far as what President Trump said about her with the speculation that he made about, I don't know if that's right or not or anything. He does that honestly all the time. Like, this is nothing new for him to do that, but we've seen this kind of argument come up before with Barack Obama back in the day, and now it's happening with Harris. And it's going to be one of those scenarios too, where she's already going through it as being a woman when she shouldn't be. She's going to be dealing with those sexist comments and those suggestive headlines and things that are coming up. And I'm hoping that, like Brandi said, that the press actually treats her just as a politician and not as the first Black woman that could potentially be, and use that as a crutch to tell any possible story about her. But it's going to be very challenging for her. And that's why I said I believe she's going to be very strong in the debates. She's going to be up for that challenge and ready to help lead the Democrats back into the White House.
Stay with us. We'll be back with Tony Black, reporter for King 5, DJ Wilson, publisher of the Washington State Wire, and Brandi Kruse, correspondent for Q13 TV. It's the Week in Review. I'm Ross Reynolds.
Support for KUOW comes from Buddha Builders, a veteran-owned business offering custom outdoor living spaces, including patios, driveways, decks, and more. Details on how to schedule an on-site consultation is at buddhabuilders.com. Invest in your Zen.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices. Sunny and warm in Seattle, 73 degrees now, expecting to reach at least 77 this afternoon. Then it's a clear sky overnight with a low of 58. Tomorrow, sunny with a high of 82. It's 1:45, and we return to KUOW's Week in Review.
And I'm Ross Reynolds, in for Bill Radke, with Tony Black from King 5 TV, DJ Wilson, publisher of the Washington State Wire, and Brandi Kruse, correspondent for Q13 TV. The economic crisis that we're facing is only going to accelerate. And with local governments and state government unable to collect the taxes that they usually do, and with people looking for more help from government, where is that going to leave us when it comes to the greater Seattle area and also the rest of Washington state? DJ Wilson, you've got a handle on the state budget, and where's this going to go in the coming months as the politicians try to reconcile the shortfall versus the huge needs?
I think it's pretty dire, honestly. I think any sort of glossing over this is short-sighted. I mentioned earlier Governor Gregoire's cuts made as a result of the general fund going into deficit in September of 2010. But of course, the recession began with the sort of collapse of Lehman Brothers in September of 2008. So we've got this long-term cycle, a structural cycle at the state, but also among our cities and counties that is going to be very difficult to face down. And back in 2009, when Barack Obama came in as president, he had teed up for him from the Bush administration TARP and stimulus package and a bailout for automobiles. And so Washington State that year got about $3 billion in funding that straight from the federal government that they could use to maintain programs. And they were able to then pass through some of that to cities and to counties. That's what helped us forestall those draconian cuts that came later in 2010. That's what they're arguing about now in DC, and why we don't yet have agreement on an additional economic response. But it's going to be a long time. And the impacts of city and county funding, those go straight into the communities usually. So sometimes, funding can be kind of ethereal, or maybe it's debt servicing or all this stuff. But cities and counties, they pay directly for jobs in the community, and it's going to hit us hard.
And this, of course, was the whole basis of the Seattle City Council debate with the mayor over dipping into reserve funds, which is a question when your revenue's not matching up to your needs. Is do you dip into reserves? The mayor saying no, not yet, and the city council members say no, this is it. We really need to do that. Have we seen any kind of evidence of what government cutbacks have done? We've seen, of course, less bus service, but is there anything that kind of jumps out at you, Brandi Kruse, when you think about the economic issues facing state and local government and how we're going to be seeing it?
I don't know that obviously we haven't even seen like the tip of the iceberg yet. And I don't think we really have a complete picture economically of how devastating all of this is going to be. And that's part of the reason the mayor wanted the council to use a little caution in draining our savings account for the time being, is because until we really have a clear picture of just how bad it's going to be, to take from that fund so quickly. I think she was concerned about, we've seen cuts right here and there, hiring freezes, and this is something where I had asked the chief the day before she announced she was leaving, which is, if not for anything, for fiscal reasons, is it smart to be cutting SPD's budget? And the reality is all the city agencies have to cut their budgets and trim down. But, obviously SPD's budget was cut for a different reason. So I'm not sure what the long-term impacts are going to be. One of the things I will say is this is a wake-up call for a democratically run state and democratically run cities that have bloated budgets. Senator Phil Fortunato, bless his heart, he wasn't a successful candidate for governor, but he's been warning for years that the state's budget was too bloated and that if there were an economic downturn, we were going to be in big trouble. And when he said that, I kind of laughed him off because we have this great economy. And then the coronavirus pandemic hit. And so hopefully moving forward, as the state reevaluates its spending and makes cuts where it needs to make cuts, it doesn't over time bloat back up to this stage where, God forbid, when there's another economic downturn, we're back in the same position. Our government needs to operate a lot more leanly.
Ross, if I could jump in, you
Sure.
asked about this, about the effectiveness of spending and government programs. You didn't say the word program, but there is an often overlooked but really fundamental piece of government economics that when you take money and you from the population at large, you're usually taking it from people who have money. Meaning, if you have an income tax, it's because you have income. If you have a sales tax, it's because you're purchasing, you've got access to credit or to cash. And you take that money and you put it into the pockets of people who don't have money, they're not going to save that. In other words, all of that money that goes into their pockets is going to get spent, and it creates a multiplier effect in the economy. So one of the key elements of government economics in terms of financing fiscal policy is if you take $1 from somebody's savings because they've got money and it's sitting in a bank somewhere in an account collecting 0.01 interest, take that $1 from savings that is not getting spent and you put it in the hands of somebody who may be struggling to feed their children or struggling to have healthcare for their babies, put it in their pocket, they're going to go spend that. And then the person that received that money is going to go spend that $1 and that $1. So it creates this multiplier effect where you take $1 out of savings by taxing somebody that has it, and you put it in the hands of people who direly, desperately need it, you're going to create a multiplier effect of 4 or 5 or 6 times the spend when you fund folks at the very low end of the income ladder.
Tony Black, how about you? When you take a look at these looming crises for government spending, what are the stories that you think we're really going to want to keep an eye on moving forward with government not having the funds to pay for whatever it wants them to do?
You know, for me, I still think there's still so much we just don't know about, like Brandi was saying, like what's going to happen like in the long run in terms with this virus, and like how, you know, we are able to kind of adapt to. I feel like from where we were in March to where we've gotten now, I think people have kind of maybe just now starting to find kind of quote unquote a groove, so to speak, that they can kind of like being able to kind of adapt to how things have gone. And if there were to be, you know, more changes, or there was another uptick in the virus, and then there's more cuts, and we're kind of just shuffling money all over the place. Like, I'm not the most well-versed in the budget, so I'll defer to DJ to kind of maybe help clarify what I'm saying. But one of my concerns would be that if we are constantly reshuffling the budget, but we don't really have an idea of where this end game is going to go as far as with the coronavirus, like at what point do we keep just digging ourselves into a bigger and bigger hole? So that would be one of my concerns. Maybe DJ, you can answer to that.
Yeah, answer that, DJ. And also, what about this notion that there's actually a lot of money in the state budget that's could easily be redirected or cut elsewhere? What do you think about those two questions?
Yeah, I think on the question of redirecting dollars and whether there's enough efficiency in government, that is going to be an eternal conversation, and good minds are going to reasonably disagree on that one. And that's part of the democratic process. How we pay for our services is a nuanced issue. At the state level, of course, you have to have a balanced budget. You've got to either cut services, use reserves, or raise revenue through taxes. And so the more we cut, the more we have this downstream implication of diminished economic impact. But the net spending has to be zero. At the federal level, I think we've seen really a flip of the script. I think just empirically, the last sort of 10 years of Republican or the last 2 decades under the Bush administration and under the Trump administration, when you've had a Republican-controlled Congress, it was really not great in terms of fiscal stimulus. And frankly, we're at a place now where we're racking up $1 trillion in debt every quarter. We've never seen anything like that. We had $1 trillion in debt over the course of an entire year in the worst case scenario under the Obama administration. And that recovered relatively quickly by the end of his first term in office. So we're in this place where, frankly, to Tony's point, I'm not sure anybody has any idea how we're going to pay back all of this debt at the federal level. But there's this interesting question about whether we even should. And AOC and Pramila Jayapal and some folks think that we shouldn't. And I'd love to get into that conversation, but we're running out low on time, so I'll save it.
Yeah, and you know, it's as often as these days, any news conversation can get pretty grim. So I really wanted to finish on more of an up note and ask each of you, what's bringing you joy these days? What's actually made you very happy? It could be something big, it could be something very small. Let's start with you, Tony Black. What's bringing you joy?
Well, I recently got an air fryer. That was great.
Right.
So that has brought me a lot of joy and saved me a lot of time. But really, I've been kind of taking advantage. I recently moved up to closer towards the Green Lake area. So I've been really kind of taking advantage of trying to get out and just enjoy some of the weather, you know, mask on, of course, and walking around there and just kind of being outside and around people. Like, you know, we've all been cooped up. I've been reporting from home, you know, since we started. And so like, I've had a really good week, so to speak, of just kind of enjoying things and being out there in my air fryer. So
a good walk and do it. And air fryers too. How about you, DJ Wilson? What's brought you joy this week?
You know, I think one of the things that happens in these times is we all see our worlds get smaller, and we have more importance on our local community, neighborhood relationships and family relationships. And so the things that give me joy is I've got 2 quick ones. One, my uncle, who went into the hospital, spent on March 20th, and then spent 42 days on a respirator. On August 28th, he will get out of his long-term care facility after going in for COVID in March. And 2, I'm going out to the coast with my son, who's 13, and a couple of his boys, and we're just going to camp for a couple of days and enjoy the Washington coast. So it'll be great.
And Brandi, how about you? What's brought you joy this week?
Well, now DJ's uncle going home brings me joy. Your uncle, is that who it is? That's awesome. That's great news. I got a negative COVID test. That brings me joy. The sunshine is bringing me joy. My little puppies, one of them broke her 3 front teeth, so she needs to get her teeth redone. So I feel bad for her, but honestly, and I know this sounds terrible, but work brings me joy because it's been a busy news cycle. I live for it. I love it. News is my outside of work passion as well. So I'm just blessed every day that I have a job. And this is going to be my plug for independent journalists out there. I've been making a push for people who are blessed enough to still have full-time work, to even if it's $1 or $5 to donate to some of the great independent journalists that we have in the city. I'm blessed that our company gives us great benefits during this time. And so if you have any money to spare, we have so many great publications with journalists who are working really, really hard, just like the rest of us. And they deserve some love during this challenging news cycle that will not end ever.
Absolutely.
Co-sign.
And I'll just leave my 10 cents. I just finished The Power Broker, which is this amazing history of Robert Moses by Robert Cairo, which was really great. And my other little moment of joy was Mexican chocolate ice cream from Fruitos.
Oh, that sounds good.
Check it out. Thanks very much for joining us on Week in Review. Tony Black, reporter for King 5, DJ Wilson, publisher of the Washington State Wire, and Brandi Kruse, correspondent Q13 TV. Our show produced by Sarah Leibovitz. Our live stream brought to you by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Teo Popescu. From all of us at KUOW, be good to each other and have a great weekend.